Key West gave him this palette that nobody else had, and so it kind of infused the work. But it didn't make him famous right away. He worked and he worked and he road dogged. I mean, you can go through old newspapers and find like Tuesday afternoon shows at the Student Union at Indiana University, Purdue University in like February. Like, not a glamorous show. He was just this kind of oddball that people really liked.
Welcome to Forum, Beyond the Pages, the podcast that tells the stories behind the stories of Florida Humanities award-winning magazine. I'm Andrew Quintana. We're celebrating some of the Sunshine State's greatest artists and entertainers this season as we speak to the writers featured in our spring 2025 issue of Forum. This week, author Ryan White on his story, The Song That Changed the World. Margaritaville. Need I say more? The name instantly conjures up images of the Florida Keys, cleverly named cocktails, and of course, the man behind the brand, the late great Jimmy Buffett. It's hard to imagine, but before the hotels, merchandise, and kitschy restaurants, Margaritaville was just a popular song that put the relatively unknown folk singer on the map. However, as Ryan White discovers in his story for Forum magazine, Buffett was able to navigate the shifting tides of his career by simply being himself. You just a few seconds ago if you were a Jimmy Buffett fan, and you said yes. I think it was a yes, but it was a yes.
Yes.
Is that why you decided to pursue this story?
Yeah, in part. I grew up in Michigan. I had an uncle. I think everybody had a crazy uncle. My crazy uncle lived in Tampa. And so every 3 or 4 years, the only travel that we did growing up, that we could really afford to do growing up, was we would drive 2 days down I-75 from Ann Arbor, Michigan to Tampa, Florida, spend a week hanging out with my uncle, going to Clearwater, all that. He was a Jimmy Buffett fan. It didn't really get through to me then. But when I got to the University of Michigan, I became friends with a guy from Cincinnati, and Jimmy is huge in Cincinnati. This guy named Brett Johnson got me, he introduced me to Buffett, and I started listening to it. And as a kid who didn't go anywhere, there was this fantastically huge world. There was adventure, there was intrigue. Yes, there was partying, but there were all these faraway places that seemed pretty amazing. And then I got out of school and I got to travel a lot, and I kind of pulled away from it for a while. And then one day I looked up and I was 40 and I had a kid and a mortgage and I wasn't going that many places anymore. And I kind of reconnected with it in a different way. And in the time that I had kind of stepped away from it, I saw how big the brand had gotten. And I was really curious, how you change with the times. How do you grow? How does a single song that was, Margaritaville, it was a top 10 hit, but at the end of the year, it was the 14th biggest hit of 1977. How does that become a world? How does it navigate 40 years of American culture and become this phenomenon that it became? And so that became the animating question that kind of set me down the path of the book.
You mentioned how big the brand of Jimmy Buffett was when you started this project. It's really hard not to picture all this famous iconography that's associated with him and the Margaritaville brand. But I think your story does a good job of portraying the kind of outsider he was before his 1977 hit. Can you tell me a little bit about who Jimmy Buffett was as an artist before all the Margaritaville fame?
He was an outsider for a long, long time. He grew up, born in Pascagoula, Mississippi, grew up mostly in Mobile, Alabama, was living in Nashville with his first wife, writing really kind of traditional sort of, for the time, outsider folk songs in the late 60s and very early 70s. Stuff that had some clever wordplay, had some interesting stuff going on musically, not anything that really stood out. He wound his way to Key West very famously. Gig in Miami was postponed. He and Jerry Jeff Walker and Jerry Jeff's girlfriend set out in an old Packard down the overseas highway, allegedly stopping at every bar along the way. Key West gave him this palette that nobody else had, and so it kind of infused the work. But it didn't make him famous right away. He worked and he worked and he road dogged. I mean, you can go through old newspapers and find like Tuesday afternoon shows at the Student Union at Indiana University, Purdue University in like February, like not a glamorous show. But at the same time that he was doing that, at the same time he was, living in Key West and kind of absorbing everything from that moment in time down there. A scene was building in Austin. Jerry Jeff had ended up there. Willie Nelson was fleeing Nashville and moving there. And so there was this early outlaw community around Austin. Ray Wiley Hubbard was there, all those guys. And it was a place where you could make a living playing music, which you couldn't in just Key West at that point. So he spent a lot of time in Texas. He wrote Margaritaville, started it, in Texas after hanging out in a Mexican restaurant in Austin. So he didn't get a lot of radio airplay. He was just this kind of oddball that people really liked.
So after toughing it out in this offbeat folk music scene, he finally does have a smash hit with his 1977 album, Changes in Latitudes, Changes in Attitudes.
Attitudes.
Yeah.
I have to remind myself too.
Yeah, it's a tongue twister. How did it reshape his trajectory as a musician after it was released?
It gave him bigger crowds. Immediately, he played Central Park that summer. I think he was the number 2 on that bill, if I'm remembering right. He opened stadium shows for the Eagles. People who saw him once would go back and see him again, and they would bring people, and the crowds got bigger and bigger. So what it really did was, it allowed him to, in those days, you now had the budget to record in Montserrat, like what they did for Volcano, which was, in the studio in Montserrat was owned by George Martin, the Beatles. Right before Changes in Attitudes came out, he was able to buy 33-foot sailboat that he named after a bar in Portland, Oregon called the Euphoria Tavern. So he had the Euphoria, but he pretty quickly upgraded to a larger boat for sailing all over the Caribbean. And the crowds got bigger. And the interesting thing was the crowd stayed bigger. And so it really, that period gave him the career that would sustain him through the 80s, where, he really wrestled with, how do you fit into the changing musical tides? And he had an album or two where he tried to fit somebody else's idea of what would break through, and it didn't really happen. So he eventually in the early 90s went back to just being Jimmy Buffett. But by then, the crowds were huge. He could go to Cincinnati and play 5 nights. He could play stadiums. He could do things like that. And once you have that kind of loyalty, it just doesn't go away. You're always going to have a career, and his just, maintained at a really high level.
You write about this disillusionment with the island life that Buffett portrays in his songs, especially the ones that made him a superstar. Did these closely resemble the themes of his own life, or was this just a world he was creating?
One of the things that I've always found interesting is that, Margaritaville is actually somewhat of a sad song. The guy in that song is really sort of like, if he was our friend, we would pull him aside and try to help him. He's falling apart. He's drinking too much. He's hurting himself. He's blaming everybody but himself until the very end. And that, sort of came from, I think the spirit of that came from 2 things. One, he had not at the time been able to follow up on the momentum that Come Monday had given him a few years earlier when it broke into the top 40. Nothing else had really connected since then, So you can kind of connect that to, I don't know the reason I stayed here all season with nothing to show but this brand new tattoo. He was working exceptionally hard. What was there really to show for it? And then, the opening about the tourists all covered in oil. People had found Key West by that point. They were coming down. The families were coming down. Spring breakers were coming down. The quiet, uncrowded island was starting to fill up, and I think they could all see the end of those perfect days that they had been living through. There's one of the funnier things is there's a verse that they cut out of the studio version. It's over the years about old men in tank tops cruising the gift shops, checking out Chiquitas down by the shore. They dream about weight loss, wish they could be their own boss. Those 3-day vacations become such a bore. That would become a version of the people who were buying the Margaritaville blenders and staying at the Margaritaville resorts and, taking those 3-day vacations, because there really was only one Jimmy Buffett, and most people can't hop in their own airplane and fly to their own little villa in St. Bart's or their place in Hawaii, or do some, outrageously cool trip. So, I don't so much know if it's a disillusionment with the lifestyle or with with all of that, but just in understanding, I think a realistic understanding of how the world does change and people find places, and tourism is a thing, whether you wish the beach was empty or not.
There's a quote from Buffett you use that I think speaks to the other aspect that you cover in your story, which is that he says, "I sell escapism." I'm sure he was referring to his music in that quote, but I think it's also kind of fitting for the businessman he would become. His success with his 1977 album, I don't think it just kicked off a successful music career, but it seemed like it was a business career as well. How did he turn that island life into a business?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very unintended, not the kind of thing that you ever could have, you ever could have predicted, and he didn't. I think the quote that's in there is from a High Times interview that he did in 1976, which is a really, really good interview. What's funny is he said, and this was before Margaritaville hit. He said, I'm not going to go out there and try and sell my lifestyle to America because they ain't going to buy it, and they never have. Well, it turned out they would, and they did, and they continue to do that. But it really was, pretty accidental. One of the fun little chapters of the story is in the 80s, when things were not, again, he still had a solid touring business, but the records weren't selling as much. He still wasn't getting radio airplay. All of those things. And the old Mexican restaurant chain Chi-Chi's, they discovered was doing a Margaritaville night. I think it was on Tuesdays. And so he sued for the copyright on that, which, song titles are not normally a thing that you can copyright. There's like at least four different songs called Wrecking Ball that I can think of. But Margaritaville was distinct, and Margaritaville was his, and that was the argument that they took to the courts in the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and they eventually won that. And then once you have the trademark, you have to use the trademark, and so they opened the Margaritaville store in Key West, which led to the Margaritaville restaurant, and it led to kind of just more and more opportunities. People were buying the shirts, they were putting out a written, printed newsletter that they were mailing to tens of thousands of people. So again, it was one of those things that nobody set out to do. It just kind of, somebody tried something and it worked. And it's weird to introduce a snowball metaphor into the conversation, but that snowball just started going downhill, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And why not? I think more than anything else, I think what you can say about Jimmy Buffett is he made a lot of people happy. And if people want to stay at a Margaritaville, give them a Margaritaville to stay at.
This whole issue of Forum is about great Floridians. And as we mentioned before, Buffett isn't really a native Floridian, but he is the face of the Keys, and he really did help shape its current image. But outside of all that we've come to associate with him in pop culture, why do you think Jimmy Buffett and his legacy have endured in Florida?
He's that guy. I mean, he's maybe the version of Florida man that is better than the popular version. He could fish, he could surf, he could sail the boat, he could fly the plane. He created this image of the beach bum that I think was functional. Since Ponce de Leon was running around there looking for the fountain of youth, Florida has been this, this kind of place of opportunity in the popular imagination, I think. And, Jimmy not only represented that, on the radio, on albums, on album covers, he took it on the road. And he took it on the road every year to places. And so he represented that, and he kind of carried it proudly. Yeah, he wasn't born in Florida, but, there probably aren't many more people who kind of encompass or represent Florida quite the way that he did.
That was Ryan White on his story, The Song That Changed the World. Forum, Beyond the Pages, is produced by Florida Humanities. Our music was created by Tampa Bay area musician JJ Padishall. You can follow him on Instagram at JJ Padishall Music. Want to get the latest issue of Forum delivered to your door 3 times a year? Become a Florida Humanities member by visiting floridahumanities.org/membership. Until next time.